Now we're going to apply what we understand about the acronym DIDLS for analyzing poetry to Billy Collins' poem, Introduction to Poetry. You'll remember this is an Ars Poetica. After we analyze Billy Collins' poem, then you can choose to analyze either Marianne Moore's poem, Poetry, or Archibald MacLeish's poem, Ars Poetica. Follow along with me as I read Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Now, pause the video and read it out loud yourself once. Next, we're going to use our DIDLS chart. DIDLS is an acronym for the tools we use to discover the tone and the meaning of the poem. The D stands for diction, or word choice, the specific words the poet chooses intentionally. The I stands for imagery, or language that appeals to the five senses, the things we can hear, smell, taste, touch, and see. The next D stands for details. These are the observations that the poet makes, the attention to the minutiae, and the way he uses these details to create meaning. The L stands for language, very specifically figurative language. And the S stands for syntax. This is the order of the words on the page, the order of the words in the line, or the order of the words in the stanza. So now let's look at how Collins uses language to create meaning about poetry. So if we start at the top, we remember that we're going to use the title, Introduction to Poetry, and we've established that that means we're going to be introduced to poetry. Maybe this is our first meeting. And Billy Collins begins the poem in the first line by saying, I ask them to take a poem. And so we would have to ask ourselves, who is them? My guess is going to be students, because it's typically students who are looking at an introduction to poetry. So in this poem, Billy Collins is creating metaphor. It's an extended metaphor from the top of the poem all the way to the bottom, where everything he says is a comparison for what he asks his students to do with a poem. So over here on my DIDLS chart, you can see the first one is diction. So what kind of words, what word choice does Collins use that helps to create meaning in this poem? I noticed things like a color slide, press an ear against its hive, water skiing across the surface, waving at the author's name, torturing a confession, beating it with a hose. So these are particular words and phrases that seemed important to me. Then I go to the next letter in the acronym, I, for imagery. In imagery, we're looking for things that we can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. The first thing I can see is I'm holding a color slide up to the light. The second thing I can see and hear is the buzzing of bees as we press our ear against the hive. I can touch the wall where I'm feeling in the dark for a light switch. I can see the idea of water skiing across the surface, and I can see the idea of tying a poem to a chair or beating it with a hose is something maybe we can touch. Then you go down to the details. The details that Collins focuses on help us to see the poetry by choosing tangible objects, like a beehive, a color slide, a mouse dropped into a poem, water skiing, waving at the author's name on the shore, torturing a confession out of the poem. So one thing you may have noticed is in the first three, I'm referring to a lot of the same things. The same words create the same images are also the details that Collins is focusing on. It's okay if that's the case. These aren't all unique individual ideas. Then we look at language. Language is that figurative language, the metaphor. So I've already mentioned that the entire poem is a metaphor. We're comparing what it's like for students studying a poem to experiencing the poem. So he tells them to take the poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. What does he want us to do? Well, if you know what a color slide is, you know that it's like a thumbnail of film from, the olden days before digital photography. And when you would hold a color slide up to the light, you could see it more clearly. So I think he's telling us to shine a light on this poem, something we can do to see it more clearly. And then he suggests pressing our ear against the poem, like pressing it against a hive. And I don't know about you, but that press an ear against its hive idea sounds a little dangerous to me, putting your ear up against a beehive. But I think that there's something in that. I think he's really suggesting that we listen to the poem and we're not afraid of it. So let's look at the next comparison. In the next one, he says, he, the teacher, drops a mouse into the poem and watches him probe his way out. And so in this comparison, I think he's saying there are ideas in the poem that are waiting to find their way out to you, the person who's trying to understand it. And then he suggests walking inside the poem's room and feeling the walls for a light switch. I've already mentioned this once, but that idea is, when you walk into a dark room and you put your hand against the wall and you're feeling for a light switch, he's making the comparison that we should approach studying a poem that way, that we should sort of walk into it in the dark, but not be afraid to feel our way around until we find what it's trying to say to us. He says that he wants his students to water ski across the surface of a poem. And I think that means really the sheer enjoyment of it while waving at the author's name on the shore, just kind of, hey, look at me out here. I'm actually enjoying this. I think that's what the author would like to happen. And then in the last two stanzas, he says, there's a shift. There's this change in idea. He says, but all they want to do. And so now he leaves what he, the instructor wanted his students to understand. And instead he shifts gears and says what the students want to do. And what do they want to do? They want to tie a poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. What he's saying there is students tend to think that poetry has to mean something really big and grand and that they're always struggling to figure that out. But if we look at these first 5 stanzas, we know that that's not really what the author wants us to do. He wants us to dive in the dark and just experience it and enjoy it. He goes on to say that students beat it with a hose to find out what it really means. Clearly, Collins doesn't think that that's the best way for us to get to the end of a poem. That brings us to the last S, syntax. If you read the poem using the enjambment, and that means that you read the lines until you see punctuation that tells you to stop, you really get the fullness of meaning. I hope you kind of heard that when I was reading it. However, if you pause at the end of each line, you'll notice that in most cases, the pause creates a tension, a kind of waiting to see what the next line is going to reveal. So this poem has 7 stanzas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stanzas. Mostly 2 or 3 lines each. But one line is all by itself, and this is a stanza of its own. And you might remember, that's the line where he's asking his students to kind of dive in even if they're afraid. So let's just try to read this first stanza, pausing at the end of each line to see the tension that Collins builds. He says, I ask them to take a poem. And if we wait there, what's he asking us to do with this poem? And he goes on to say, and hold it up to the light. Again, if we pause there, holding a poem up to the light is kind of profound. Light is usually an understanding or sort of an epiphany. But then he goes on to say, like a color slide. In doing that, he creates a simile, a very clear simile, using the word like or as to compare the poem to the color slide. And in that, he's saying when you hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see it more clearly. All right, so the idea of DIDLS is really to just sort of fumble our way through the poem. I don't want you to feel like there's a desperate right or wrong to everything you do, but while you're trying to figure it out, I want you to not be afraid of it. I want you to kind of look at the words carefully and see what they reveal to you. Now, you're going to try this with the two poems that appear on the next slide. Your assignment is to read Mary Ann Moore's poetry and then read Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica. These poems take dramatically different approaches to understanding what poetry is, the idea of a poem about poetry. But I think if you spend a couple minutes with them and use the DIDLS acronym, you're really going to be able to discover and uncover meaning that you didn't realize was there. I'm going to post my analysis of each so that you can check yours against it.